Good morning. Please enjoy our professional lighting this year. Thank you. Welcome to this year's Exeter Literary Festival. My name is Katie Adams, and this is my first year as board chair. I grew up in town, attending the local public schools through middle school and then the academy. When it was time for college, I moved to New York City, where I stayed through graduate school and a career as a book editor for several publishers, including a 7-year tenure at W.W. Norton. In 2018, my family and I moved back to my hometown, and I now live just up the road with my husband and 3 sons, running my own freelance editing business. This festival offers an opportunity to give back to the town that made me who I am, and that now gives so much to my children. The event was founded in 2018 by Renee Allen and a group of teachers, librarians, writers, booksellers, and activists to celebrate and champion Exeter's literary culture. For their tireless efforts, I'd like to thank this year's board, Peg Aronian, Renee Allen, Lara Bricker, Jack Herney, Tim Horvath, Don Jelly, and Steph Kuiper-Schmidt. Thank you. In recent years, we've attempted to both lift up our local authors and bring to our community of readers a breadth of new voices and ideas. To that end, we have a packed day of events for you. We're starting off with best-selling novelist J. Courtney Sullivan, interviewed by yours truly, and ending the day at 4 p.m. with National Book Award-winning historian Dr. Taya Miles. In between, we have hometown favorite Keith O'Brien talking baseball and his recent best-selling biography of Pete Rose, panels on self-publishing, memoir, and romantasy, a poetry reading curated by Portsmouth's last poet laureate, Dianelli Antigua, as well as a selection of poems from our own Exeter High School students. If you're eager to extend the weekend, we have a poetry reading and reception tomorrow at 2 p.m. at Art Up Front Street. The gallery has been a wonderful partner to us this year, as has the Exeter Public Library and team. The full schedule of the weekend is available on flyers that are around the back of the town hall. Water Street Bookstore is selling books in the back all day, and authors will be available to sign books in the room in the back after their events. I would also encourage you to keep an eye out around town for our 2nd annual Storefront Poetry Project, in which the work of local poets is displayed in the windows of local businesses. This is an important moment to celebrate the arts, to treasure and uplift the written word. Book bans are on the rise. Libraries are increasingly under threat of censorship and defunding, and the federal government has recently taken steps to limit or avoid hundreds of words from government documents, words like expression and social justice. To quote 18-year-old Rishabh Jain, a musician whose opportunity to play with the United States Marine Band was recently revoked, if we're a society that's suppressing art, we're a society that is afraid of what it might reveal about itself. We're suppressing the very essence of what makes us human. To that, I would add, no one worries about banning something unless it is powerful. Today, we celebrate the power, knowledge, and joy of the written word. And without further ado, I will bring out our first of today's featured authors, J. Courtney Sullivan. She is the New York Times bestselling author of the novels Commencement, Maine, The Engagements, Saints for All Occasions, Friends and Strangers, and most recently, The Cliffs. Her work has appeared in a range of magazines and newspapers, and in 2017, she wrote the foreword to new editions of 2 of her favorite classic novels, Anne of Green Gables and Little Women. She lives in Massachusetts with her husband and 2 children. Please welcome Courtney Sullivan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Katie, for inviting me here. I'm really honored to be with you today. Katie and I both lived in New York at the same time, and we mostly knew each other through the magic of social media. And I watched her young family, forming and growing, and then when she moved back home to New England, I was kind of like, that's interesting. I kind of want to do that. And I followed her path. Eventually, my husband and I and our 2 kids left New York, and now we're back in Massachusetts, where I grew up. And I'm so happy to be living in New England. And driving into Exeter this morning, seeing your hands-off rally forming on the bridge, I was just like almost in tears. It was so beautifully New England, all these very old buildings, and then these wonderful, vibrant protesters. I drove through, I was so happy. I honked my horn, and I was like, I gotta go again. I went around the block, honked my horn again. So anyway, very happy to be here with you. I'm gonna read a short bit from the Cliffs, and then Katie and I will chat. So this is the very beginning. The house, long abandoned, had stories to tell. The house was a contradiction, clearly well loved at one time, but left to rot. Jane first saw it from the water. She was 17, narrating a sunset cocktail cruise aboard Abe Adams' lobster boat. The previous 2 summers, Jane worked days, welcoming parents, balancing strollers and sunblock and coffee to go as they and their excited offspring climbed aboard. Jane spoke cheerily into a scratchy, corded microphone, spouting the same set of facts 4 times daily, receiving near identical responses from every group. Jane would say, "Awadaquoit's pedestrian drawbridge is the only one of its kind in the United States." The passengers would nod at others in their party. Interesting. She would say, "Lobster was once so plentiful in Maine that they fed it to prisoners for every meal. Reformers railed against the practice, calling it cruel. And to this day, by law, prisoners in Maine can only be fed lobster twice a week." At this, the passengers would chuckle, since they themselves had, within the last day or so, doled out almost $20 for a boiled 1¼ pound hard shell. This is in the 90s, by the way, that they were paying that. Because I know some of you were like, that is not what that costs. When the boat got far enough offshore, Abe pulled up one of his traps, and Jane plucked the most impressive lobster out for all to see. She waved the slippery creature, legs and antennae writhing, in the faces of children aboard. They, in turn, either grabbed the lobster eagerly or shrieked and hid in their mother's shirts. There was no other possible reaction. But that summer, because Jane had class during the day, Abe offered her the coveted evening tour, on which the tips were better, and neither lobsters nor children were present. Instead, couples sipped weak vodka cranberries out of clear plastic cups, and Abe hewed close to the rocky coastline so they could ogle the area's grandest oceanfront properties, the ones set far back from the road, hidden behind tall trees and long winding driveways, visible only by boat. That night, 15 minutes into the trip, the sky turned an astonishing shade of orange. As she did every night, she directed the crowd's attention to a tiny island, maybe a quarter mile from the cliffs, where harbor seals rested on the rocks. Technically, it was named St. George's, but Jane had never heard anyone call it that. The island didn't seem big enough for a name. In a bad storm, the whole thing disappeared beneath the waves. The island to your left was christened St. George's by the British explorer Archibald Pembroke when he discovered this part of the world in 1605, she said. Jane wasn't sure this was true. At some point, she had seen a map of Pembroke's journey, and his final destination appeared to be a spot some 300 miles south. She had brought this up with Abe, who said Pembroke had possibly landed in several different places. Jane suspected Abe didn't want to probe further, as doing so might require changing the script. Whether or not Pembroke had actually set foot there, in 1930, the local antiquarian society had erected a small stone monument on the island to commemorate the 325th anniversary of his voyage. The monument still stood. From this distance, it was nearly indistinguishable from the natural rocks on either side, but for the fact that it alone was plagued by a barrage of seagull droppings, which rained down upon it like so much white paint. obscuring the inscription on its face. As Jane mentioned the monument to the passengers now, a woman in the front row nudged her husband and pointed in the other direction, up toward the cliffs. "That house gives me the creeps," she said. Her voice was loud enough that Jane stopped speaking and turned to see what she was pointing at. Jane's eyes anticipated what she was used to seeing across from the island, a spot where two giant pine trees stood right where the land jetted out into the sea, with overgrown hedges running along the cliffs on either side. One of the trees had fallen in the storm. She could see its roots reaching up toward the sky like long, grasping fingers. It had left a gap, through which Jane glimpsed a house, pale purple, very old, with turrets and elaborate trim painted green in some spots and blue in others. One upstairs shutter dangled precariously. The window beside it had been smashed. A white curtain billowed out from within. The woman was right. The house was creepy. Jane had the strongest urge to go there and explore. She was drawn to deserted places, those patches of the world where you could feel the life that had been lived there and was no more. New England was full of them, boarded up factories and state mental hospitals, an abandoned amusement park where she and her sister once climbed the rungs of the flume ride all the way to the top. Jane considered herself law-abiding in the extreme. She would never shoplift or run a red light. She had never had a sip of beer. But to her, trespassing in such places didn't feel like a crime. It felt like honoring whatever came before. Thank you. Hello, does it work? Yes, it works, good. Should I sit here? Are we too far apart? I can't, or now we're too close together? I don't know. Okay, good, okay.
So you've written several novels since your breakout novel, Maine. What made you decide to return to Maine as a setting, and how do you see those two novels sort of in conversation with each other?
Oh, I love that question because I do see them in conversation with one another. So my first novel, Commencement, was published 15 years ago, and it was set at Smith College, my alma mater, and it was in many ways kind of a love letter to Smith and female friendship. And I called it Smith in the book, and every building is a real building and all of that. Then 10 years later, and a few books later, I wrote my book, Friends and Strangers, which is also pretty much set at Smith, but I didn't call it Smith. I didn't call it Northampton, because I feel like that book is, some of it is similar, but I was sort of exploring maybe a darker side of it, of that world, and of higher education in general, and some of the sort of complexities of all of that. And I didn't want to name Smith when I was doing that. So similarly, the book I wrote after Commencement was Maine, and then 10 years after that, I started this one. And I think, Maine is very much about a family like my own, an Irish Catholic Boston family who goes to Maine in the summertime. And they see it really just kind of, they love it there. It's their happy place, as it is mine. But they see it in kind of a surfacey way because it's where they go to have fun and go to the beach and all of that. But this book much more kind of digs into the soul of the place itself and the history of the place itself. And I think in Maine, I did use real place names. This time I didn't use a gunquit, even though the book is clearly set in a gunquit, because there were certain things. So like, one example of this is that a lot of the cliffs is about indigenous history in New England. And a gunquit, for any of you who've ever been there, which I bet is all of you, or many of you anyway, when you pull into town, you start to see the signs that say, "A beautiful place by the sea." And the story is that in the Abenaki language, that's what a gunquit means, a beautiful place by the sea. it turns out that many tourist-friendly expressions just happen to, equate to a Native American word. And so it has been said, and I'm pretty darn sure it's true, that a gunkwit doesn't mean that. A gunkwit doesn't mean anything. But that is the sort of the legend and the story that has gone on for a long time. And so initially I wanted to put that in the book, but then I thought, but I love a gunkwit. I don't want to, and what if I'm wrong? And I don't know. So I changed the name to a different name. But ultimately, after the book came out, I did speak to more historians than I'd already spoken to, who confirmed that it is true that that is not what that means.
So you're getting darker and more edgy as your career goes on.
So edgy.
So edgy, yeah. So in about the first half of the book, the reader is very invested in this beautiful old house and all of its historic treasures. But then as the novel goes on, you start interweaving this idea that the house, however special, itself replaced what came before it. Mm-hmm. You have a line, "A house was a foreign object, invasive to its surroundings. Nature would keep trying to assert its dominance, to force its way in." Did writing and researching this novel reframe your idea of how we identify history and historical?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think, also a lot of my books have kind of some element of a self-fulfilling prophecy to them. So when I started writing this, I lived in New York, and then in pretty short order, I had moved to New England. And then soon after that, I bought an old Victorian house. And the line you just read is like, I think about it all the time whenever I'm at the hardware store trying to find another way to fix some broken thing in my home where nature is trying to come in. And I'm like, no, please stay out, water, bugs, whatever you are. But I think moving back here also just made me think so much about, like, when I was growing up, I was a kid who loved the local history. I would like beg my parents to take me to Louisa May Alcott's house the way other kids wanted to go to Chuck E. Cheese. Like, I went there so many times. And that's still so important to me. The archive where Jane works in the book is the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, which is this incredible archive of American women and their stories and their work. But then there's the flip side, which is who gets to tell the story, right? And so one thing that we love to talk about in New England, of course, is firsts. Like, we're crazy about firsts, So where I live in Milton, in the Blue Hills, there's a building and it says America's first weather observatory. But this is a part of the world where there was so much native life before white settlers arrived. There were people here for 10,000 years, and I feel like they were probably observing weather. That was one of the things they did. That was kind of how they ruled their entire life. So these sorts of things, and even my own house has a plaque with a man's name and a year from the 1800s there, and it's just one of those things like, but what about all the other people who lived in this house? And what about before there was a house? Who else was here? Mm-hmm. So this idea of sort of claiming history and who gets to tell that story was even more kind of present for me once I moved back here.
Yeah. I think, storytelling seems to be a big theme in the novel in general. Jane is an historian of women's lives. She preserves and tells their stories. There are also a number of spiritualists and mediums in the book who tell the stories of the dead. You are a novelist. You tell stories. Mm-hmm. Do you see these three professions as in conversation with each other?
Oh my gosh, you have the best questions. I
wrote them down.
I want you to come on the road with me and just always be the person who asks me questions. Or I can just hand your questions out and be like, forget your questions, read Katie's. Because yes, I really do. When I, especially when talking to mediums, the way they talk about these voices of the dead coming to them, and how sometimes they wish they could shut them out, and sometimes they have to shut them out. It just so many aspects of that remind me of fiction writing, where it's, to me, there is some kind of slightly woo-woo element to fiction writing, because it's like, of all the stories you could tell, why this story, and of all the characters who could tell it, why these characters? And there is something kind of like mystical. I don't know the answer. And I'm often just kind of like going about my day, and in the same way that I'm thinking about my mother or my sister or my kids, I'm thinking about my characters, and all of a sudden it will be like, oh, that's why she did that, because in 8th grade, this thing happened to her. And I mean, I think novel writing might actually be like a form of mental illness, but thank God it hasn't been diagnosed as such yet, so I actually make it a job. Yeah, so absolutely with the mediums, I see a lot of parallels, and then with historians, I mean, so much so, and what you just said about book bans and libraries and the need to kind of control books, it's really fascinating because that's so much of it, right? It's like, if you go to these archives, if you see the original stories as they were lived, then that is proof of what actually happened, as opposed to some fantasy version of America and what happened. And I think there's a reason why some people don't want us to have access to that full, complex history.
So after you complete your journey to like the darkness in your literary work, maybe spiritual camp in Maine, you can become a medium. It's good to have that on the back burner.
I could talk about mediums forever. And I don't know, has anyone here ever been to Camp Etna, which is the spiritualist camp that this is based on, the spiritualist camp in the book is based on? No one here has been to Camp Etna? It's not that far, guys. Come on, we should all go. It's really a fascinating place. And it's, there's just, the thing about, I mean, Jane has a teacher in high school who says most lives will be lost to time, and this is a line that kind of resonates for her throughout her life. And I think it's so true, because there's just I love doing research, it's so fun, and there's just so many pockets of American history and story that most people don't know about, but not out of any sort of malice, it's just that there's so much, right? So these spiritualist camps were a huge thing in America, especially around the time of the Civil War. You had Mary Todd Lincoln employing mediums literally around the clock. They lived in the White House with her so she could connect with her sons who had died whenever she wanted to, and a more everyday person who also wanted to connect with their lost sons would go in the summertime, their summer vacation might be to one of these camps, these spiritualist camps. So Etna, Maine, which is a very sleepy town, because of this camp that was there, became a booming place. They brought the train tracks in, the train started stopping there, they built hotels and restaurants. And if you go there now, it's still there, but it's very, very, very reduced. There's no longer a train, but there are train tracks. There are a few mediums there on any given day, but these little Victorian cottages all remain. And I also wrote in this book about Sabbath Day Lake, the Shaker village in Maine, where, today there are 2 remaining Shakers at Sabbath Day Lake, and in the entire world. Those are the only remaining Shakers anywhere. But you can go there and you can, read about and imagine your way into thinking, what was it like when there were like 1,000 people here?
Yeah, I want to talk about the sort of a plot strategy. In the novel, there's a beautiful rundown historic house that undergoes some drastic renovations. That decision is one of several big choices that the character Genevieve makes that have serious consequences and really cannot be undone. It seems to me that the novel was really grappling with that idea, that there are some forgivable sins and other mistakes that simply force us to live in their aftermath. How did you think about these kind of like devastating pivot points in the plot where it's like there's really no coming back? It's just everything is shattered in a new way, and yet things have to kind of go on.
Yeah. I mean, there's one that I won't say what it is, but like the saddest, worst one. Do you know what it is?
Oh, it's so terrible. I was walking my dog in the woods and I ran into this woman who's my neighbor, and she was walking her dog and she's like, I just got to that part. How could you? And I'm like, I'm so sorry. I know it's terrible. But yes, I think that's right. I think, it's like each of these characters, because throughout the course of the book, you meet all the women who lived in this house over hundreds of years, and also women who lived on that land. And each of these women does have like one or two sort of maybe devastating, maybe exciting and unexpected sort of life events that end up sort of like being the hinges for everything else that happens to them, I guess you would say. And yeah, I guess I was curious, like I sort of view the book as these women kind of being in this ongoing conversation with one another. Even though they never meet, if that makes sense. And I don't know if any of you live in old houses, but like in my house, there's in the wood, like in the door frames all over the house, I find that there was a little girl named Clara who lived in my house at some point. And she was very naughty and always carved her name in tiny letters everywhere. And it makes me so happy to see those. Like, I feel like that's something that maybe only a New Englander would appreciate, and other people would be like, why did someone vandalize my house? Who is this menace named Clara? But to me, it's like I feel this weird connection to her, even though I don't know her, right? And so it's like I feel like the story of the house kind of lives on in these objects that have been left there and in the sort of house itself.
That is a perfect segue to the next question that I wrote down.
We're such a good team.
So the first line of the novel, as we heard, is the house long abandoned had stories to tell. There's a lot of attention paid to the physical interiors of the homes, the central house, but also the other homes where the characters live, and their stuff.
Yes.
There's an image of a junk drawer with the grandmother's red plastic rosary beads and the mother's pink plastic cigarette lighter, which really stuck out. What kind of details were important to you in building the physical world of these homes, and why did you give them such careful attention?
Ooh, I love that. It's so funny because, when you write a novel, you don't necessarily remember what you put in it.
That was a good one.
The red plastic rosary beads, my Auntie Dot, my great aunt, she had these red plastic rosary beads that hung from her rearview mirror of her 1986 Cutlass, which was my first car that I got in 2003. And they were still on it, still on the mirror. So that must just be in my brain, wanting to be put in a novel, the red rosary beads. I'm obsessed with objects. My book Engagements is about a diamond ring that passes through 4 couples over the course of a century. And I feel like this book is a little similar, where it's like using the house as the sort of vehicle. So the house in the book is based on a real house. And my husband and I and this other couple are very dear friends. We would always go to Maine together. Before we had kids, we would go to Maine together in the summer for a little break. And the 4 of us were there one day, many years ago, like 12 years ago now. And we were just driving around and we came upon this house. And it was basically the house in the book. It was this beautiful old house on the cliff in Cape Nettic. And it was gorgeous, but it was clearly abandoned. Everything was sort of like falling apart and the grass was overgrown. But my friend Melissa and I, because we are very nosy like Jane, we felt like we could go right up to the windows and just look inside and see what was going on. And our husbands are like, this is appalling. What are you doing? And we saw when we did that this house was fully furnished. Like, there were rugs on the floor, there were couches in the living room and paintings on the walls. And for anyone who ever loved, Hardy Boys or Nancy Drew, this was just irresistible to us. Like, where did these people go, and why did they leave in what seems to be such a hurry? And why did they leave all these things here? The banister from the second floor to the first had caved in, and there were certain strange things that had happened over time. And after that summer, this became our ritual, was that we would go there first thing when we got to Maine and check out the house. And it became like, in our heads, this house belonged to us, even though clearly it did not. After doing that for 5 or 6 years, we arrived one day and the house was gone. It had been totally torn down. There was a huge foundation dug. Clearly there was going to be a McMansion there now. And I found myself really so sad about this, even though it wasn't my house, but I still felt this sense of, ownership or something, attachment. And so I wrote down everything that had been in the house, like the paintings and the dollhouse in the corner of the living room and the banister. And all of those things, even though it wouldn't matter to anyone but me, did end up being all the pieces of the mystery in the book. Like the banister is in the book and the dollhouse is in the book and all of these things are in the book. But yeah, I just think objects are fascinating. With the engagements, when I started writing that, it was because my best friend was getting engaged, and she wanted me to go with her to look at engagement rings, and she wanted, because she was proposing to herself, she wanted like a vintage ring, So we went to this store in New York, Doyle & Doyle, that only sells beautiful vintage diamond rings. And as she's looking at each one and finding out about the cut, clarity, and color, I'm looking at them and just feeling story coming off of them and thinking, but if this was someone's engagement ring, why is it here? What happened? And so that then just launches a novel.
Yeah, several.
Yeah, several novels.
Yeah. Ownership is a recurring theme in this story. I think who owns the house, but also their bodies, their graves, their legacies. Mm-hmm. How do you think it shaped your ideas of ownership that you're writing here primarily about women characters whose relationship to ownership has often been less straightforward than men's?
Mm-hmm. Right. So that's a very, very good question. I think this notion that most lives will be lost to time is true across the board, but it is especially true of women and non-white people, and so especially non-white women. And so this story of women in American history. So, okay, can I tell a weird side?
Obviously, yes.
Okay. Can you really say no? What are you gonna kick me out? Okay. So, this is why I wrote about, I made Jane work at the Schlesinger Library. So when I was writing, it's weird because I feel like this book is also kind of in conversation with the engagements, because when I was writing the engagements, I decided that I wanted to not just tell the story of these 4 marriages and, that the ring passes through, but also explore why do we even want diamonds and where did that all come from? And so I got very into reading about the advertising campaign that went into De Beers diamonds and came to find out that the line, "A diamond is forever," was written by a woman named Frances Garrity in 1947. And she herself never married. That was all that had been ever published about her. It was literally 2 lines in a book. It was it was written by Frances Garrity. She never married. I was like, what? I need to know a lot more. So I set off on this quest to research Frances and became kind of obsessed with her. And I felt like if I was going to, she had passed away by the time I started this book. And I felt like if I'm going to write about a real woman, which I had never done before, I had never written a real person into a novel, especially because she's not, Queen Elizabeth or something. She's not someone people have heard of. So if you're going to bring her story forth, you've got to do it with a lot of integrity and accuracy. So I approached it, my background is in journalism. I approached writing Frances much more like a journalist than a novelist, and maybe her chapters are kind of boring for that reason, I don't know. But I just wanted everything to be, correct. And so one of the many weird things I did to try to get to know her, I went to the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, where Jane works in the Cliffs. And they have a wonderful collection of women in advertising. And they have nothing on Frances. No one had anything on Frances, but they had a whole collection on her predecessor, a woman named Dorothy Dignam, who was writing for De Beers in the 1920s and 1930s. So this was the time when Mad Men was just becoming a huge hit, and I was kind of amazed to think, there were actually women in advertising in the 20s, the 60s, 70s. idea that that was just when women emerged into that business is not quite right. So in the process of writing this book, I had heard that there were these memos, these secret company memos that went back and forth every year between the ad agency where these women worked and De Beers in Johannesburg, because they could not enter our country at that time because of antitrust laws. So it was a very big deal that every year one person from the ad agency would take this huge leather-bound book to Johannesburg to show the De Beers client, all the ads they had done that year, but also like all these sort of psychological things they had just sort of tried to work into the ads, and they were always polling people, like asking, why did you spend what you did on your wife's engagement ring? And a lot of men would say, like, I don't know, I didn't know what to spend. And so then they would come up with, well, let's come up with like some criteria for that. And so then they would say, how about 2 months salary? How about 3 months salary? And so they would make an ad and it would say, isn't 3 months salary a small price to pay for forever, or something like that. And that became just like part of what we do in this culture. And then they would constantly be polling to see, is it happening, is it working? So these memos had been quoted in various nonfiction books about diamonds, and I could just never get my hands on them. And I was told by the authors of these books, not to stereotype them, but they were all men. They all were like, oh, I think they're at the Smithsonian, I think they're at Harvard, I think they're like, they sent me on this wild goose chase, and I could not find them anywhere. And I came to the conclusion that these memos, which had been quoted originally in an Atlantic Monthly article in 1974. I'm getting somewhere, I promise. This is so bizarre. I came to the conclusion that I don't think the people who wrote the books ever saw the memos. I think they always quoted the same few quotes that were in that Atlantic Monthly article, right? So anyway, point of this is, at the very end of writing this book, one of the things I wanted to do, I wanted to go to Frances Garrity's house, because I just wanted to see what it was like. I didn't have that much to work with, and so I had contacted the woman who bought the house from her in the 90s, and she was very, very kind and said, sure, come over. But we just could never figure out, we could never get together and find a good date. So the date we finally got was the day the book was due to my editor, and it was done. At that time, I was handing books in the day they were due. Now I'm
Gold star.
Way, way not like that, unfortunately. Yes, I was aiming for that A. And so I asked my editor, is it okay to hand it in a day late? And she was like, okay, fine. People hand books in like years late, so yeah, she was okay.
Yes.
Yeah, decades. She was fine with that. So I just thought maybe I'll get like a little bit of color, like a paragraph out of this, right, to describe something in her real house. So I go, I meet this woman. She doesn't really know much about Frances, like most of us wouldn't know about whoever sold us our house, right? She knew a few little things, but she was nice, and as I was leaving, she said to me, oh, you know what, when Frances left, she left this big box of papers in the basement, and I never got rid of it because, I don't know, I had a feeling I should keep it. And she said, I even put it in the trash a couple times, and then I took it out of the trash. So if you want it, you can have it. And so she gives it to me, and it contains all the secret company memos. Yes. And I was able to really infuse the book with all of this juicy information. But additionally, for years after I finished that book, I just thought about how Frances, she always really wanted to be known. She wanted to be known for her work and what she had done, and she never got credit. It makes me happy now, if you Google her, there's tons of stuff. And there was nothing when I started the engagements, even though I get no credit for being the reason she gets credit now, but that's fine. There's something called the Frances Garrity Awards in advertising now, which is so cool. And so I decided I want to make an archive, a Frances Garrity archive at the Schlesinger Library. See, it comes full circle. You were like, where the hell is she going? But this is where I was going. And so now, in the last couple years, I did, create with the Schlesinger this Frances Garrity archive, and it contains all the memos. So if anybody ever wants to see them, they have to go to Frances's stuff, her collection. And the Schlesinger, I always knew I wanted to put it in a book because I do feel like it's so, what they're doing feels to me anyway so similar to what I'm trying to do in work, which is like just keep these stories alive and tell them in as honest a way as I can. Sorry, that was so long. Now it's 5 p.m. and the festival is over.
No, it was worth it. It was worth it. If the box had been empty, it would not have been
Right,
worth
there was
it.
nothing in the box.
So then, do you think about your legacy?
No, oh my gosh, no. It's, okay, so I have little kids. My kids are 6 and 7. And it's, not everyone should have children, right? Not everyone wants children, and if you don't want them, you shouldn't have them. But we both know writers who don't have children, right? I think it's tough. I think when you're a writer, you're by yourself all the time, and you're kind of thinking about yourself a lot. And then, I don't know, for me, having kids has been such a gift in this way because it's just been very freeing. I really don't care what people think about me anymore. Does anybody else feel like that once they had kids? I'm just like, I don't know, I like them, they like me, we're good. And critics, say what you will. And it's very freeing because I think, every novel I've written, and when I look back now, each one is like a time capsule of where I was at that moment in life, right? So like commencement, I still had a full-time job as a research assistant at the New York Times. I wrote it in my apartment on the weekends. I was in my 20s, like my roommates were like going out, getting drunk, coming home, eating egg sandwiches, and I'm like writing my little book. And also getting drunk and eating egg sandwiches, but
Yeah, I was gonna say.
you're like, have you read the book? I wrote Friends and Strangers when my kids were just like tiny babies, and it's my only book that really doesn't have any research in it, and I think it's because I was just like
In it.
My whole life is
Yeah.
research right now. Like I don't understand anything that's going on, and everything is so new. But anyway, as far as legacy goes, no, I don't care. I mean, I love writing. I can't believe I get to do it for my job, and as long as I can sort of like get paid to do it and keep our mortgage payments going and all of that, then like I'm thrilled. And legacy, don't care.
Okay. I'm glad you brought up motherhood because one of my favorite quotes in the book is, "Motherhood is the most radical act in the world, and we've turned it into tapioca pudding. What's more toothless, more invisible in this culture than a mother?" Which a character says, not,
Yes.
yeah. And I immediately thought of a novel from a few years ago called Night Bitch by Rachel Yoder,
yes.
in which the mother of a newborn believes she's turning into a dog at night. So like the opposite of toothless.
but I know
the
about
opposite
it.
of toothless.
Yes.
So because the experience of motherhood for that character is like so vicious and feral, do you think that writers are approaching the topic of motherhood with like more teeth? Or do you think we're still kind of in that same tapioca pudding era?
I think a lot of writers are approaching it. I mean, the other thing is like menopause and perimenopause. Like all of a sudden, like you never heard about that, and now like every single day is just
Yes,
like there's a new book
very
about
hot,
menopause.
yes.
It's like
Yeah.
whoa, okay, which is great, I think, and it's great to have like various stories about motherhood and different. I think a lot of times the novels are about people who like hate motherhood, which is a bummer. I don't know. There's a vast array of experiences, obviously. I think when we talk about when my kids were little, there would be these articles about like how, and especially because with COVID, like every day there was an article that was like, this has reached the breaking point. Like mothers are going insane, and then I was like, oh, okay, good. We've acknowledged that. So is anything gonna change? Oh, no, we're just gonna keep doing it. Okay. And then there's another article 4 days later that's like, now we've really reached the breaking point. I think those become frustrating when people say things like, no one ever talks about this. No one ever told me about this. No one ever talked about this. I always think to myself, no, they are talking about it all the time. But unfortunately, like the larger systemic changes that could and should happen don't happen. I'm sure now with our current administration, everything will be fixed and it'll be great. Yeah. So that's to me what's frustrating. And I think a lot of times with motherhood, like every bit of it is so all-consuming, and then you go on to the next stage, and then you go on to the next stage. And so like sometimes I'll see people in these sort of like Facebook parents groups that I'm in where they're like having the freak out that you have when your kid is 1 month old, right? And that's what's so amazing about mothers is like if you've had a 1-month-old, you're like, oh, this is easy. Here's what you do. But you don't know what the heck to do with a 7-year-old or whatever you might have in that, moment. I do think that sort of writing about motherhood. I mean, Department of Speculation was like one of my favorites, which I read before I had kids. So good, right? And just that sense. I mean, that's a beautiful version of that story, right? Because she's trying to figure out, like, I want to be an art monster, but I also love this baby. And how do I do both things at once?
And that they're both so incredibly intense experiences.
Yes, absolutely.
It's not like one is hard and one is soft. They're both everything.
That's right, yeah. I think there's a lot about, how we write about it, how we tell the stories, but then there's also like this sort of, I don't know, I recently was part of this Working Mothers Summit that the Boston Globe did, and it was so cool. I mean, Michelle Wu was there, and she was like nursing on the couch while being interviewed, and it was so amazing. But one of the other writers there brought up this topic that comes up quite a bit with writers, where they're kind of like, but why aren't you asking men how they do it? Why are you always asking women? To me, that doesn't bother me at all. I feel like it's really good to talk about how do you do it? How the heck do you have children and have any kind of career or other things? And like literally tell me how, because I love tips for how to survive.
Exactly. So I'm just going to ask one more question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. I'm wondering about your views about how the publishing industry has changed since you started, and when Reese Witherspoon picked your book, did you get to hang out with her? Is that part of it? What do you think about this celebrity book club ecosystem?
Yeah, I think publishing, I feel like it has changed so much in the 15 years that I've been doing it. My first novel, I remember in the contract from the publisher, it said something about ebooks, and I remember asking my agent, what are ebooks? And she's like, well, I don't know. She's like, kind of like, nobody knows, but I think they think it's a thing that they're gonna probably do. So it's good to just have it, I'm like, okay, whatever. And it's like, by the time my third book came out, half the sales were in ebooks, right? And so it's just constantly changing, and I'm so happy that my part of it is to sit in a room and just write the story, because the rest of it kind of freaks me out. And when I get too in the weeds, I'm just like, there's been all these movements, all these times of like when Maine was coming out, it actually got a really bad Publishers Weekly review, which, then it did really well, so fine. And I'll consider it like bad dress rehearsal. Oh no, it was a Kirkus, but Kirkus. Kirkus. But it's like bad dress rehearsal, good play. Now I'm like bad Kirkus, good other reviews when it actually comes out. That's my hope. But when I got a bad Kirkus, I was so stressed about it, and they're like, you know what you could do? Go on Twitter. So then I spend many years of my life lost to just being on Twitter, which I don't think ever sold any books for anyone.
But we probably
Not
met
me.
that way.
We met that way. So that's why I moved to New England, because Katie did. So it all worked out. But yeah, I feel like there've just been many, many changes. And then it always seems like there's one thing that might save us. So in early days, it was Oprah. It was Oprah's book club. And then in more recent years, you've gotten Reese Witherspoon, you've gotten Jenna Bush. I was very lucky that Friends and Strangers, my last book before this, was picked by Jenna Bush, and that was awesome. She has such an amazing community of writers.
She does.
Everyone who's been picked in her book club is just so nice, and she always has us all come on, or invites us all to come on the anniversary of the book club every year. So we always have a little reunion, and everyone is just lovely. And now there's a little thread on Instagram with all the Reese authors, and they're so nice to each other. It's just a very positive, lovely thing where somebody new gets picked and they add them to the group and congratulations, and it's very lovely. Now, as far as hanging out with Reese goes, no, it did not happen at all with this book, but when the engagements came out, she optioned it, and we were pretty much best friends for a week. But then it ended. And I remember when my editor, Jenny Jackson, got married, I was at her wedding, and Reese Witherspoon had called me that day to talk about something that was going on with the movie that was then never made, but
Yeah.
it was fun. It was really fun. So we were talking on the phone, whatever, and so I said, oh, I've got to go because I'm at my editor's wedding, you know? So the next morning, my husband and I are like in our hotel room, probably slightly hungover and watching Sweet Home Alabama, and I get a text from Reese that's like, how was the wedding, girl? And I'm like, oh, great. Like, I'm watching Sweet Home Alabama now. Like, you know, just really surreal, and but whatever. I feel like she and Jenna Bush both, they love books. Like, they truly love books,
Yeah.
which is so nice.
Yeah.
And has helped a lot. It's hard because it feels like more and more a few books get to like rise to the top, and
Yeah.
then many books come out and they just don't. You know, there's a lot. That's one of the things that has changed in the time that I've been publishing, is like just the coverage for books isn't there as much as it used to be, as you know, and that can be hard. And I feel for people who have like a debut novel coming out, because, you know, it's like, how do you get that word out? And whenever I see anyone reading something that's not one of like the 4 books of that year, I always want to interview them and be like, why did you pick that book? And,
Yeah.
you know, how did you find it? And all of that, because it's still mysterious to me.
So I think the takeaway then is keep writing, because you might get to text with Reese Witherspoon.
Totally. I have
Yeah.
her cell phone number, so
Great.
if you want it, I'll give it.
Perfect. We'll call her after this. So do we have any questions in the audience? I think we have a mic and a runner. Right here, Steph. Right there.
Hopefully I don't. Last year, this thing started ringing when I started speaking.
Uh-oh.
So, first off, I absolutely loved Maine.
Thank
It was
you.
one of my favorite books.
Thanks.
What I'd like to know is, what was the book that you read that you said, I want to do what this writer's doing?
Ooh, I love that feeling. It's such a good feeling. And that's like such a good way of describing, because when you're a writer, the only thing that I don't like about being a writer is that it does change your relationship to reading a tiny bit, because like all writers begin as readers, right? And you love books, and so then you want to write one. And now that I am a writer and I know so many writers, and I'll read a book and I'm like, oh, why did they say that? Or I wonder if the editor made them put that. Or, you know, I'm like always
Made them.
suggested, encouraged, improve the book by adding. What am I talking about? I think so. I remember taking this class when I was in high school, but it was at Boston University. I went to a high school called Boston University Academy, and it was a women's studies class, and it was just like fiction about women, by women, and it was so incredible, because that really wasn't what I had studied in high school at all. And we read housekeeping in that class, and it was amazing. One of the books we read in that class was 1,000 Acres by Jane Smiley. Oh my gosh, it just like blew my mind. And forever, I would say that was my favorite novel. Because it was this book that was like, in some ways, very domestic. And there's always these rules you hear. So one of the rules I had heard in a writing class at that point was like, you never name things. Like, you don't name like, anything that would date a book, and that's just not true at all. So like, I remember in that book, which is a very serious, beautiful, intense book, like the characters at one point are watching Phil Donahue, and I just remember that being a revelation, like, well, they're watching Phil Donahue, and this won the Pulitzer Prize, so, it's a very like character-based family domestic story, but it's also just like so deep about our culture and our country and misogyny and all of these things. In more recent times, the author Anne Enright, her book, The Gathering, I read when I was writing Saints for All Occasions. I read that book and I was like, oh, shoot, I should be like a travel agent, which is one of my 2 secret fantasy backup jobs. And because like this woman, if someone can do this, then like she should be the only one where anyone is allowed to read. Like, let's just all read Anne Enright. So yeah, those would be the 2.
Some good ones. Do you have another question? Oh yeah, back here.
Can you hear me? Mm-hmm. I've read all of your books as a big fan.
Thank you.
Big fan. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about your own progression in your writing, specifically like going from a lot of like prep and Maine, going to something like The Cliffs, which was very different in many, many ways of those earlier books. Is there anything that you can attribute it to? You talked about loving research and history and moving to New England. Is that basically it?
Probably, and I think just also, another thing I love about being a writer is like, it's not like being, like a gymnast where you're going to peak when you're 13 or something. Like, hopefully you get better because you understand more about sort of the world and life in general, and just sort of what you want to kind of focus in on as a writer. So for me, my first 2 books, I was working as a researcher at the New York Times for 2 of the opinion columnists. That was my day job. And all I ever wanted to do was just quit my day job so I could write fiction full time. And then I did that, and within a day, I was like, oh God, I love research. I miss it so much. So after that, all my books have just been infused with a lot of research because I remember like when I was in college, I interned at the Atlantic Monthly, which was then in Boston. And what the interns did, and even the staff editors did, we fact-checked. That was it. Half the staff was just fact-checking because that was extremely important, right? I don't know if it's still the case there, but they had a lot of money and manpower put into making sure every sentence was correct. And I remember one of the editors at one point saying that she loved her job because she always got to have a different job. Yes, she was always a magazine editor, but one week she's editing something about, the history of like bear species in America, and the next week she's writing about a heart surgeon, and the next week this. So every week she gets to kind of explore a new world, and I feel like that's what novel writing is like too. I mean, when I was writing The Cliffs, I was so deeply entrenched in the indigenous history of New England and the Shakers and the mediums and all these things. And then you finish the book and you're like, okay, now I'm going to write about someone who won the Powerball, and that's what I'm writing about now. And then you become obsessed with that. And it's just kind of like great fun that you get to do that. And not many career paths sort of let you do that.
I think we have time for one more question. Is you right here? Okay, we can do 2.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm in 7th grade and I just started writing. Do you have any tips for new writers?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're here. And you're a writer, so you're just gonna write, and that's wonderful. I think the best tip I ever heard was from Anna Quindlen, and I think about it all the time. She was talking about how when we read, we fall in love with other people's work, and we think, oh, I wish I wrote like that. I wish I sounded like that. And this still happens to me all the time. But the only thing that's unique at this point in human history, we've kind of told all the stories, right? So it's like the only thing you have that's truly unique is just your voice. And even if you don't love the sound of it, you have to write in your voice because that's you, that's what you have. I come back to that all the time because if I read a novel, I don't know which novel. I mean, this year I read The Bee Sting. That was the last book that really knocked my socks off. And I was just like, why can't I write this book? Or I did a panel with the author Meg Mitchell Moore about the book The Wedding People. Oh no, sorry, about my book. But we spent the whole thing talking about The Wedding People because we both loved it and we were like, I wish I'd written that. And yes, that will happen, but just keep writing. Also, I did a really interesting thing. So when my kids were babies, I was teaching a class, a writing workshop at the start of the summer. And I said to the students in the class and to myself, I said, let's make a pact. When you're a writer, you're full of angst. You're always, saying, oh, this isn't good, or why am I writing this, or blah, blah, blah. I said, we're not going to say that we're never going to do that, because that's not feasible. We're gonna have a summer of no angst. Like this summer, every time you start to think my writing is garbage, why am I writing this or whatever, nope, I'm gonna push that to September, thank you. And it really was so freeing because a lot of being a writer and getting down to the work is like getting through sort of self-doubt and all of that. But I think that like, when you are a writer, at least I remember, this is such a weird thing to remember because I don't even remember like my phone number, but I remember being in a bar when I was in my early 20s and talking to some guy in a bar who I never saw again and saying something like, well, he was asking, what do you do? And I was like, well, I'm like, you know, I work here and I'm writing a novel. Like, well, like everyone, I'm writing a novel, haha. And he was kind of like, I don't know anyone else who's writing a novel. And I think when you're a writer, you think like, everyone is, but actually everyone isn't. So, you know, you just have to kind of like keep doing it. And oftentimes people will say to me like, I would really love to write a novel. And I'm like, no, you wouldn't. You would love to have written a novel. Like I would love to have run a marathon, but I'm not going to. But when you actually are someone who writes, like you're a writer, you've got it. So just keep going.
We'll book you for a couple years.
Yes.
A couple years from now. Okay, I think we're going to wrap up there. Courtney's going to be in the back corner there signing books, and our next event will start at 12:15. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.